The second of 3 videos on chapter 12, which is the chapter on the pursuit of perfection, or the other word for it is reform. And we talked about the cause of this in the last video and all of these different movements that arose out of the goal to perfect American society, to solve all the problems. And they actually believed that they could make a perfect world, that perfect city on the hill. We laugh at that today, but they were quite serious about it, and many people devoted their lives to perfecting American society. So we talked about the changes in the treatment of the insane, the changes in education, particularly the changes in what to do about the abuses of alcohol. And I want to spend this one talking about probably the most important movement of the time, which was the abolition movement, and then if I have time to talk about what to do about poverty at the time too. Okay, so abolition, the queen of reforms, slowly by 1850 had absorbed all of the other movements. People who started out working for women's rights or for the better care of animals or prison reform, eventually everybody ends up working for abolition, the abolition of slavery. And this is a huge movement in American history and led directly to the Civil War later on, almost split the country. The basis of abolitionism is the basic foundation of America. If in Christianity all are equal in the eyes of God, if Christ died theoretically to save all our souls, the souls of all men, then slavery is unchristian in a Christian nation. And if this is a democracy in which all men are created equal, as Thomas Jefferson, very large slave owner, said, then slavery is also undemocratic. And from the beginning, as we saw, there is a tension in America between increasing democracy and increasing slavery at the same time. And at some place, something has to give, and it did in the Civil War. Before 1830, what was done about ending slavery? All of the founders favored abolishing slavery, but no one knew how to go about it. The Quakers did. They banned slaveholders from becoming Quakers. If you owned a slave, you were kicked out. And they began to organize anti-slavery groups very early, well before the Revolutionary War. One of the early 1800s movements to solve the problem of slavery was the American Colonization Society. This was formed in 1817, don't care about the date, and basically the goal was to free slaves. And then, of course, the problem with free slaves was, what do you do with them then? That was the sticking point. The Colonization Society proposed free them and send them back to Africa. And that would solve the problem. So you would not have a mixed race society, which almost all whites looked on with horror. That was the real sticking point with slavery. Of course, you can immediately see the problems with this. First of all, these people are no longer African. They have no idea anything about Africa. They've been here for generations. They don't want to go. On a practical level, it was logistically impossible because slaves are also increasing in population over time. Somebody figured out with a paper and pencil that if you had a string of ships going across the Atlantic about 10 feet apart, you would still not have enough ships to remove all the slaves from America, let alone the problem of how do you reimburse their owners? Nobody had solutions for this. Great idea. It actually was tried. On the west coast of Africa, an area was carved out and several boatloads of slaves were sent there. It is now an independent country in Africa, and if you think about it, it's a very well-named one called Liberia, freedom, Libra, freedom. The capital of Liberia tells you when this colony was started. The capital of Liberia today is Monrovia, under Monroe's administration. Excuse me. Too windy today. So that's not a great idea. You are not going to get rid of slaves by removing them from America. Okay, so what do? The first attempt was to convince Southern slaveholders to free their slaves voluntarily. And this is where the Grimke sisters, who I call the Grimm sisters again, in slide 8 show up again. The slide dealing with abolition, of course, is slide 6. They came from a rich South Carolina family. There were 14 kids in the family. Only the sons were educated because women, of course, were not even considered qualified to be educated in most southern areas. But these were very smart girls, and they read their brothers' school books and basically were self-educated. They visited some relatives in Philadelphia one day and were converted. They became abolitionists. They were banned from ever returning to their home in South Carolina. They had a nephew who actually ran a school for slaves in Charleston. So even though educating slaves was totally illegal all the way across the South, there were huge exceptions. We saw this with Eliza Pinckney as well. They devoted their lives to ending slavery. They wrote and they spoke from personal firsthand experience. They were raised on a large slave plantation. 1830s, they write, quote, an appeal to Christian women of the southern states. They are appealing to women. Talk your husbands into freeing slaves because this is unchristian. This pamphlet, they also gave this talk and speeches, but the pamphlets were basically confiscated by postmasters in southern states and destroyed. If a Black person was found with a copy of this or any other abolitionist material, that was a felony offense. In many southern states, there was a money bounty on abolitionists who were caught talking or spreading the word about abolition. In Arkansas, a state law was passed in the 1830s, making it a crime to even question or discuss slavery in public. So basically what the South is doing is shutting down any criticism of slavery. So persuading Southerners to give up slaves voluntarily is not very successful, as the Grimke sisters found. Okay, what do you do next? Then you persuade and organize Northerners. This was much more successful. So you have a couple of these religious revivalists, Charles Finney, Theodore Dwight Weld, who go around town to town in tent meetings and revival meetings, and their religion that they're preaching is abolition and not fundamental Christianity. They had testimonials from escaped slaves, again, an emotional appeal. This is why we should free African Americans. They had firsthand stories. Often they had speakers like Frederick Douglass, like Sojourner Truth, like David Walker, escaped slaves who turned around and devoted their lives to ending slavery as well and talked from first-hand experience. Sometimes they created separate Black abolitionist societies from freed Blacks in the North. Oftentimes they also spoke to white audiences, because if you're a white farm boy in rural Wisconsin, what do you know about slavery? You've never seen a Black person. But Frederick Douglass might come to Milwaukee and give a series of speeches about slavery, and you're curious and you go, and many people were converted on the spot when they heard firsthand some of the abuses and horrors of slavery. These guys, one of whom was a cousin of John Adams, by the way, basically fused the revival meeting and abolition, and their religious reform becomes abolition, ending slavery. Many of these leaders, white leaders, were totally non-prejudiced. They ate, slept, and worked with African Americans. This was very rare even in the North at the time. They organized town clubs. One of them, Theodore Dwight Weld, married one of the Grimke sisters, supposedly the more beautiful one, which I still don't understand how one of those is beautiful, but whatever, and formed the first co-ed biracial American college. Southerners got together and put a $3,000 bounty on his head, which fortunately was not collected. So the South is kicking back immediately. Many, many anti-slavery societies in the North, and the biggest one, the American Anti-Slavery Society. These are local clubs of hundreds of thousands of members across northern states and hundreds of clubs. It is always a minority in the North because most Northerners are just as prejudiced as Southerners, only they don't have to deal with the problem. But it's this small radical group that keeps organizing, that keeps pushing, that keeps slavery in the minds of people. They sent petitions to Congress on a regular basis. Congress for many years refused to even look at them. Somebody has gone back and looked. 75% of the signatures on petitions were female signatures. So women are heavily involved in abolition. They're heavily involved in all of these reform movements. They create publications. They develop their own printing presses. William Lloyd Garrison is a key figure in the abolition movement. If you look at slide number 7, you have a portrait of him. My contention, personal opinion, is this guy is not quite right. He's a little strange looking. He is absolutely a religious fanatic, and his religion is abolition. But he is totally a fanatic. He creates a printing press in Ohio, 1831. It was called, quite rightfully, The Liberator. And he argues constantly for immediate, unconditional emancipation of the slaves. Not now, not later, not gradual, immediate, total, and now. He was highly controversial even in the North. Remember that the mobs that destroyed the printing presses, that killed abolitionists, and some of them were killed or burned out, these are northern mobs, because in the South you couldn't operate at all. But those who operated in the North were often attacked by other northerners. The Liberator included things like, I will not retreat 1 inch, I will not compromise at all. He called Southern slave owners, I'm quoting from the magazine, tyrants, man-stealers who lead lives of unbridled lust, of filthy greed, of unequaled oppression, of more than savage cruelty. You can imagine what the Southern reaction is to this. They are being called names and they kick back. The purpose was to arouse the North, because, of course, this literature is banned in all of the South and also much of the North as well. These guys were incredibly courageous, but they are totally religious fanatics. Garrison himself was burned out and beaten up a number of times, went right back, got a new press, and started printing again. He actually, in a public square at one point, burned the U.S. Constitution because it condoned slavery. This is highly controversial in the 1830s and 1840s. But slowly, year by year, they get more people to notice the issue of slavery and to become opposed to slavery. So by the time the Civil War comes around, you have a significant portion in the North who are anti-slave. And these guys are the point men on the spear. They risk their lives to promote this movement. Another way you could oppose slavery and work to destroy it, besides organizing societies, besides publishing literature, was, of course, something we all know about, the Underground Railway. Not the only system, but there were many others, operated by ex-slaves and Quakers. Quakers literally ran the Underground Railway. It is not a real railway, for anybody who hasn't heard. It was a system of safe houses. And escaped slaves were taken from the South night by night, from one house to the other, friendly people that would keep them, almost always Quakers, and slowly moved north till they could cross the Ohio River. Once they could cross the Ohio River, they still weren't safe because slave catchers could cross the river legally and catch them again. So many had to be taken all the way to Canada. That was the only place they were legally safe. Quakers were involved with stealing slaves, freeing slaves, and certainly with the Underground Railway, moving them north. You had about 3,000, almost all Quakers, that were railway, they called them conductors. They estimate they helped something between 50, 75,000 slaves actually escape and move north, at least across the Ohio River. The most famous, of course, was Harriet Tubman, who is finally going to replace Andrew Jackson on a $20 bill, who should never be on any money due to his causing an economic collapse. Harriet Tubman will be the first woman and rightfully a great American hero. She is an escaped slave herself, tiny little woman, about 5 feet tall, who went back over a dozen times deep into the South, into slave territory, to lead groups of escaped slaves to freedom. If she had been caught, she would have been killed and probably tortured to death. So she is incredibly heroic. There are all kinds of stories and close shaves that they, basically almost got caught. There is a very famous story where she is leading a small group of slaves north, and one of the adult men just loses it. They're going to catch us. They're going to torture us. I got to go back. I'm not going to do this. Harriet Tubman pulled out a pistol. She always carried a pistol in her belt, put it up against the guy's head, and said, "You will walk or I'll blow your brains out right here." And she got him out. She never lost a person that she took out, and went back deep into the South over a dozen times to lead groups of ex-slaves out. Absolutely heroic. Should be on something to be commemorated, finally. The other change that comes about, these are all ways to help end slavery or to resist slavery. Later on, I will be talking about the new political parties, the Free Soil Party that forms when the Democrats and Republicans ignore the issue of slavery. You have enough Northerners by the 1850s that they can form their own anti-slave party. And this is a direct line to the Civil War. But these guys who published and talked against slavery were incredibly heroic, these abolitionists. Some were killed. Famous death is Elijah Lovejoy, who was speaking and printing against slavery. After he was killed, his brother was elected to Congress, I believe in the state of Illinois, where he had introduced amendments to abolish slavery, which got no place before the Civil War, of course. But remember, this is a slow reaction and a slow-growing movement. Even in the North, schools, churches, cemeteries were segregated. They were not allowed, African Americans were not allowed, even in cemeteries. They had separate cemeteries. So this is a movement that takes a long time to grow. The other thing I wanted to talk about was poverty. The book does nothing with this, but this is a reform movement, and I think it's very significant, particularly since we're still dealing with the same issue today. What do you do about a bunch of poor people? This has been in the news lately. Look at slide number 9. That is the text for it, and the following 5 slides all deal with possible solutions to poverty. This is a contemporary problem for us too. Same issues. Number 1, do people choose to be poor? I don't think anybody starts out life saying, I don't want to be poor, I want to be poor the rest of my life, but at some point, are the poor responsible for their own poverty? That is an open question. There are people today that said he wants to be poor, he doesn't want to work. I'm not getting into that, but that you still hear that today. I've heard it recently in political discussions. Do people choose to be poor? At the time, and even today, we make distinctions between the deserving poor, the poor that are poor through no fault of their own, war widows, illness, death of a wage earner, uneducated people, immigrants. This is the same issues at the time. The 1837 panic, a lot of people lost jobs. Those were the deserving poor. We still have that. We have undeserving poor, those who chose to be, quote unquote, to be poor, alcoholism, prostitutes when they got older and could no longer make a living, gamblers who had huge debts and lost everything. laziness, I'm going to use in big quotes, how lazy people are and how much they don't want to work. That is highly controversial then and now. But the question, of course, is what do you do? Who is responsible for the poor? Is it the government? Is it private charity and churches? Is no one responsible for the poor? Should they be left to die? Should the homeless be left? This is still an issue today. At the time, pretty much poverty was fairly rare until the Irish showed up in the late 1840s, because everybody had a small farm. On a small farm, unless you're wiped out by bad weather, you could at least feed yourself. So when, for example, a man died and the widow was left with a bunch of children, or there were other causes, or he disappeared in a war, they had what they called outdoor relief. Outdoor relief was the community would get together and they would bring the family firewood for fuel. They would bring them food. Sometimes towns gave them a small amount of money, or the church would get together and help them. So they would try to help out people who had suffered some catastrophe. The other solution, which started much earlier in Europe than it started here, was indoor relief. Indoor relief meant you take these poor people and you put them in literally what was called a poorhouse, or an almshouse, or a poor asylum. This is largely for adults, and all over, particularly in Ireland and England, I have seen, they're now tourist bureaus, but I have seen a number of buildings in all kinds of towns. Every good-sized town had what they literally called a poorhouse carved over the doorway. So if people had no place to go, they went to the poorhouse. For example, an older prostitute, a gambler who had lost everything, an alcoholic, whatever. Okay, now, what do you do with them in the poorhouse? You can see some of the things that were done in the poorhouse in those pictures. And there is a gentleman with a couple of little scruffy-looking kids. He is taking these poor little orphans to the poorhouse, and then a very well-dressed gentleman taking a nicely dressed boy out of the poorhouse. Children were taken to the poorhouse. If children were orphaned, that was one place you could take them, and you could go to a poorhouse and basically adopt a kid like you adopt a puppy from the pound today. They would, I need a young boy, and they would line up all the young boys, and you would walk down the line and you would pick out one, literally like you pick out a puppy from the pound. There wasn't a whole lot of checks on this, so some of this was abused, but oftentimes kids got very good homes as well from this. They're basically an apprentice system. Particularly farmers need labor, particularly young boys. When they are in the poorhouse, what do they do? What do you do with them? Because how do they ever get out of the poorhouse? You can see in that chart, most people never left the poorhouse. The death rate was very high. Conditions were not ideal. The first slide there is an ideal poorhouse, and this is a picture I took in London, not in London, outside London in a small town. And these were family dwellings that today are very nice townhomes that a family would be put in by the community and help to get back on their feet. Most poorhouses did not look that well. And over time, as more and more people sink into poverty, they become more like prisons than pretty nice places to be. They became, what do you do with them there? Do you just stick them there like prisons do today? Or do you provide work? Because we still have a strong resistance to just paying poor people to stay home and do nothing. There was resistance then at the time. How do you handle the poor? First of all, they made poorhouses pretty unattractive, so people tried to avoid them, which they did, and they turned them into workhouses. They gave them things to do, but at the time, nothing to develop skills that they could use later. What they did was shred old naval ropes and make new ropes out of them, very kind of simple, very skilled, just so they had something to do. That last slide there, when you look at those guys, I call it a human hamster wheel, which is kind of what it is. It is a treadmill. The catch to this is not connected to anything. It is just a treadmill. What is the logic behind this? First of all, there is no logic. You want these guys to do something other than sit around all day. So the only thing they could dream up is putting them on a treadmill and just walk for 8 hours a day. They got great calf muscles and absolutely no skill set that they could use when they left the poorhouse. Most people did not leave the poorhouse. Okay. Possible solutions. What possible solutions for poverty? We're still working on this. We still have a large percentage of poor people. Number one, obviously, don't throw people in prison for debt when they fall into debt, because they can never get out. One of the few exceptions, Charles Dickens, who was a good writer, who got paid by the page. That's why Dickens' novels are all 1,000 pages long. He wrote his way out of debtor's prison. Most people didn't have that skill. Better education. They knew right away. Better educated people usually do not end up in the poorhouse. Get more money, expand education. A social service for the elderly. If you had no family you could live with, you were in serious trouble when you were older if you did not die at a young age. So this is basically a social security system that was first proposed in the 1830s and got nowhere because there's no funding for it. Raising wages so people didn't fall into poverty. Gee, that's a really innovative idea. Abolishing alcohol, very clear connection to the Prohibition movement. Mutual aid societies, groups that would get together like African Americans in a town or immigrants in a town and help each other out so that if one was injured, the rest would pitch in, kind of like an insurance policy. They were quite clear that having a lot of kids at the time was a serious risk for poverty, and birth control was proposed in the 1830s as a method of reducing poverty and limiting family size. That also got nowhere because they didn't have the technology for birth control at the time. Changing the tax system to tax the wealthy, particularly inherited wealth, so that could be redistributed and end poverty on the other end. That didn't get very far at the time. Pretty much when the Irish arrive and by 1.5 million show up in destitute poverty, the whole system is swamped and everybody gave it up. There was one great idea that was proposed in the 1830s that all 18-year-olds, anybody who became 18 in America, be given $1,000 at the time to start a business, buy a farm, or become economically independent. Where was the government going to get this money? By taxing the inheritance of the wealthy. That idea did not go far at the time. As you notice, many of these ideas have been incorporated since then. They had no real solution for poverty at the time. Neither did we today. We are still dealing with this problem. The one thing everybody was clear on, and the directions were quite clear in the almshouses and the poorhouses, and I'm quoting, no money in any case to be given. Never directly give them money, give them aid, indirect charity. Help them develop skills, education, whatever. Do not directly give them money. So we still have this issue today, which is why I think it's really interesting. They were struggling with it close to 200 years ago and had very limited solutions. We are struggling with it today, have slightly better solutions, still have huge problems with poverty. And since the pandemic, increasingly huge problems with poverty. We will see how much better we can solve it 200 years later. Okay, take care. I have one more video in this series dealing with the utopias.